At the end of this week's Torah portion is a tender and poignant and simple prayer. Very straightforward, deeply emotionally attuned. Moshe, has a sister named Miriam who has been afflicted with a terrible skin disease. And Moshe, in his anguish to see his sister's terrible condition, cries out to God and says, Elna rifana la. Please, God, Moshe cries out, please heal her now. I wonder in this community how many of us have offered those words in prayer when we have stood beside a loved one who is fighting for breath or who's been diagnosed with illness or standing in the breach between life and death. Are rabbis ever attentive to the careful word choice in our sacred text, are not willing to attribute this formulation simply to poetics. Instead, they ask questions about this prayer. They want to understand why the repetition, El na refana la. What is the meaning of this? And they suggest that the first na that appears in that prayer is to be understood as a plea. Whereas the second time the word na appears, it means now. I want this now. So Moshe is both pleading for his sister's life, and he's also expressing a kind of urgency around it. I want to invite you to think about that image of Moshe, the great leader of a nation, the man who stood between his people and Pharaoh, and then between God and Israel, here now just as a brokenhearted brother, pleading on behalf of his sick sister. Please, God, just make her okay. Please, God, do this now. I heard Rabbi Kanevsky speak a little bit about this beautiful prayer earlier in the week, and he hinted that this tender prayer should make us think a little bit about Moshe and Miriam's relationship with one another, brother and sister. And that got me curious to try to dig a little bit more deeply than usual into the relationship between brother and sister. And of course, there are numerous indications that the dynamic between these two siblings is really not completely beseder. Something is a little bit off between the great Moshe and the great Miriam. Miriam, who is so central to our redemption story, is named only one time in the Torah before this incident in the book of Numbers. And that one time when she is mentioned by name, things are a little bit complicated. So here I want to invite you to take a moment and look at text number 3 on our sheet. Here's the setting. The Israelites fleeing Pharaoh and his army have just crossed Yam Suf. They've just crossed the Red Sea. They witness before their very eyes as the Egyptian army is swallowed up by the returning tide. And Israel sees their bodies washed upon the shore, and they know now that for the first time in hundreds of years, they are truly free. And so we read in a text, Az yashir Moshe u'bnei Yisrael et hashira hazot ladonai vayamru lemor Ashiru Adonai ki gaoga sus v'rachvo rama vayam. Moses and the Israelites sing out a song to God. They say, I will sing to Hashem, for God has triumphed so gloriously on this day. But then as soon as that triumphant song ends, rather than continue on their long walk to the promised land, yet another song is sung. And this time that song is led not by Moshe, but by his sister, Miriam. So take a look, if you would, at text number 4 from Exodus chapter 15, verse 20. And then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, picked up a timbrel, and all of the women went out with her in dance and in hand drums. And Miriam answered them, sing to Hashem, for Hashem has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver have been hurled into the sea. There are obviously numerous indications here that things between Miriam and Moshe are not okay. I'm curious what strikes you as you read these couple of verses. What are the hints or the signals that something unusual is transpiring here? I'm asking a real, not a rhetorical question. Yes, sir. Loudly, please. Okay, Miriam is identified here as Achot Aharon, the sister of Aaron, not the sister of Moshe. When you are identifying someone who is the sibling of a very, very famous person, you would think that you would identify them as the sibling of that person and not the lesser famous other sibling, okay? It's a little strange. Any other things that strike you as weird here? Unusual? Yes. Miriam is referred to here as a prophet. How does the text come by assigning that designation to Miriam? Why is she considered a prophet here? Yes, I saw another hand. Yeah. Why does she say exactly the same words that were already said by her brother? You've hit upon many of the great challenges here in this text. Why does she have to sing her own song at all? Was she not fully a part of Moshe's song? She was right there when it happened just moments ago. This strange phrasing, v'ta'an lahem, she answered them. The text sometimes says she chanted back, but really it means she answered them. What is this an answer to? Is Miriam's song a rebuttal to the song of her brother? The rabbis are troubled by all of the same questions that we have and so many more. They try to explain, why is she Aaron's sister here and not Moshe's? And they say that it was because Moshe hadn't yet been born at the time of Miriam's prophecy. She does have a prophecy, at least according to the rabbis in the Midrash, when she, at maybe 5 or 6 years old, saw that her parents divorced after Pharaoh made the decree that all the new Hebrew babies that were born would die. Why risk being pregnant only to bring a child into a world of certain death? And she, a small child at that time, was the one who encouraged her parents to remarry, because who knows what the future might hold. And so they do, and baby Moshe is born and would later go on to lead the people to redemption. So here the rabbis say she's called Achot Aharon, Aaron's sister, because when she became a prophet, Moshe wasn't born yet. Seems a little bit like a technicality, like a desperate answer to a very good question, the kind of answer that only leads us to more questions. There's clearly some estrangement here. There's clearly something going on between these two that we don't fully understand. Here's what I think. There were only 3 prophets in Israel at that time: Moshe, Aharon, and Miriam. And yet the brothers, Moses and Aaron, they commune with God regularly. And Miriam is repeatedly marginalized in our narrative, so much so that her name isn't even used, excluded from leadership. This is particularly true of Moshe, who only loosens up his grip on power when he's rebuked later by his father-in-law Yitro, who says to him, Madua ata yoshev levadecha? Why are you doing all of this alone? In other words, you need your sister's help. She's right there. You don't need to do this without her. Why did Moshe try to hold all of this to himself? I wonder if maybe he doubted Miriam's nevuah. I wonder if he doubted her prophecy. Could it be because she's a woman? Or maybe he was just so consumed with his own pressure, with his grief, with his worry, that he couldn't even remember that his own family was right there by his side, ostensibly to help him when he needed it. For whatever the reason, Moshe essentially renders his own sister Miriam invisible for years. But how can there be liberation for this people when some of the people in the community, including our own relatives, are simply not seen? As Rena said earlier, Miriam's hurt by this. She distances herself from Moshe. She becomes Achot Aharon, Aaron's sister, not Moshe's sister. Her second song is a refutation of that first song. I'm here too, you know, she seems to be saying. The sisters are here too. The tension only builds between brother and sister as they navigate all of the hardships in the desert. All of this culminates in today's parasha, when Miriam turns to Aharon, the only brother who's ever seen her, in confidence. And here she disdains her brother. And I would like to point out as a parenthetical that if you quietly disdain another person or another group of people, it will likely eventually surface. So watch your text messages, okay? Because you never know who's screen grabbing from the row behind you. And even still, we all know how good it feels when we feel that we've been wrong to turn to another person, to turn to a brother or sister and say the hard part out loud. We all know that sensation of mutual recognition. You see what I see. I know I'm not alone here. Miriam and Aaron speak. They say, has God spoken only through Moshe? Has God not spoken through us as well? And then only moments later, Miriam is punished with sara'at, that terrible skin disease, which the rabbis will henceforth always associate with lashon hara, with speaking those evil words about another person behind their back. But here I want to bring in the teaching of a very brilliant teacher of Torah, a teacher of mine, Rabbi Yitzchak et Shalom, who suggests that the key to this whole story, this family dynamic, may be found not here in the book of Numbers, but way back in the book of Genesis. So let me explain. The book of Genesis is a trajectory from paradise to enslavement, from Gan Eden to Egypt. So what went wrong with our family? What led us down this terrible spiral of descent? A people who were given by God absolutely everything and end up with absolutely nothing. Rabbi Et Shalom argues that the consistent trope of the book of Bereshit, of the book of Genesis, is siblings turning on each other. Cain kills Abel, his brother, and asks, am I my brother's keeper? Then there's the generation of the flood, Dor HaMabul, in which family members turn upon one another in unrelenting rage and violence. There's Isaac, there's Ishmael, there's Esav and Yaakov. I will kill my brother. Save me from my brother. There's even Leah and Rachel, two sisters battling over the same husband. There's Yosef's brothers who hate him so much that they plot to kill him and ultimately sell him into slavery because of their jealousy. The enslavement of our people at the beginning of the book of Exodus, Shemot, comes as the culmination of many generations of siblings fighting against one another, threatening one another, undermining one another, siblings turning away from one another, answering Cain's question, am I my brother's keeper, by looking to the other square in the eye and insisting, it hardly matters whether or not I'm my brother's keeper, for you are surely not my brother. Of course, all of this weakened us as a people so sufficiently that when that new king arose and said, come, let us deal harshly with this people, we were essentially powerless to resist. Do we hear this narrative thread? Can we hear it? Our story as a people turns when Miriam, as a child of 12 or 13 years old, unnamed in the text, risks her life to save her brother, to watch over baby Moses floating down the river in the basket. It is she, a big sister, who makes sure that her brother is cared for and protected and loved. Miriam is our hero. She is the one who broke the pattern of sibling cruelty and shows that there is another way. There must be another way. Why does she do this? Because whereas her ancestors disdained and threatened and undermined their siblings, Miriam looked to Moshe and saw her own self. "You are my brother," she whispered as she slipped between the reeds alongside his basket. It is only years later, after being profoundly marginalized, maybe even forgotten by that same brother, that she now turns to Aharon, her other brother, and says out loud the pain that she's been holding for many years. Was it only Moshe that God spoke to? What about us? This leads Rabbi Shalom to conclude that Miriam's crime in this parsha is not, as we often think it to be, lashon hara. It is not speaking badly about her brother. It is turning on her brother. That simple act matters because it is not one singular act. It is paradigmatic. It is a paradigm of a time gone by, a paradigm that Miriam herself smashed when she said, "Yes, you are my brother." And it is this one act that threatens to send Bnei Yisrael back to the toxic and divisive dynamic of the book of Genesis. It inverts the trajectory that Miriam herself engineered when she took such tender care of her brother so many years before. It seems for the moment that Miriam has reverted to her great-great-grandparents' rejectionist mentality. One brother turning against another, one sister turning against another, as if one can ever fully divorce oneself from her brother. I love this insight from the text. It is such a powerful warning to us, then as it is now. But our story doesn't end there. The text goes on to tell us that Moshe is the most humble person ever. Now, why does that verse follow the verse that tells us about the words that Miriam spoke about her brother? Because it is precisely Moshe's humility that allows him in the moment that he is most hurt by his sister to understand that there is something deeply broken in their relationship. It actually crushes his heart. It awakens him to the rift within his family, an intra-communal rift, which he knows is far more dangerous and far more damning than any external threat. He knows that it's not just Miriam's fault. He recognizes that for years, in his feverish drive to lead the people to freedom, he sidelined her. He marginalized her. He demeaned her. He diminished her. He silenced her and her contribution to our collective story. He started this, he realizes, and she did not. And therefore, it is only he who can rectify this situation. And so he cries out. He cries out to God, Elna Refanala, please God, heal her and heal her now. And Miriam is actually healed. And the trajectory of the people is again miraculously shifted, brother and sister together as they continue toward redemption. I'm completely captivated by this narrative on this Shabbat because our Jewish family is breaking. I can't get out of my head the description that one scholar recently offered to capture what's happening in our Jewish community today. He called it an intra-communal Jewish civil war. An intra-communal Jewish civil war. And I want to say that the differences between us are real. And the pain that we are causing one another is real. Months ago, I facilitated a conversation between mothers and daughters who had not spoken to one another since October 8th, since they woke up the day after the atrocities and realized that they could no longer see the world the same way. There was so much anguish in that room. Something has been unleashed in the collective conscience that is turning us away from one another. Very few of us have been spared this rupture. And for most of us, it is deeply personal and profoundly close to home. Half the Jewish community today feels that the other half is illegitimate. Traitors who fail to include their fellow Jews in their circle of moral care and concern. They look at them and see people who care deeply about humanity, but not so deeply about their own Jewish family. The other half sees the first as criminally complicit, unable or just unwilling to see how our Jewish trauma and loyalty to the Jewish narrative has sealed off their hearts, leaving them fully unable to reckon with the massive human tragedy that is unfolding daily before our eyes. Most of us in this tent, on this island, are caught between those two worldviews. I can tell you personally that I feel the vice tightening its grip around my head, as if we cannot, as human beings, as Jews, live in multiple worlds at once, holding multiple fidelities to our Jewish family and also to humanity. It feels increasingly like forces that are greater than any of us are not only breaking our hearts and endangering our safety as Jews and threatening our democracy, but also breaking our family. You are not my brother. Our tiny tribe, 3% of the American population, 0.2% of the world's 8 billion people, has shattered. This is the moment where I believe we are called to grasp on to Moshe's humility. I say this to our community and I say this to myself. We all know that rabbis preach the sermons we need to hear. This is the moment in which we must realize what Moshe realized when that pillar of cloud descended and the wrath of Hashem flared up against his sister and his brother, and punishment rained down on Miriam when she was forced into mandatory seclusion from the community. In that moment, Moshe in his humility saw through his own hurt and was able to recognize that his dear sister was hurting too, that her behavior was only the natural outcome of many years of her own pain, that she needed not isolation from the community, but to be wrapped in the loving embrace of community. I wonder if we could imagine from that place of deepest humility and anguish that my brother, that my sister is only trying to navigate her own pain. Could we imagine crying out, not only on our own behalf, but also on one another's? Please, God, please help my sister, help my brother, and help them now. A friend of mine shared with me a story a couple of weeks ago. Her daughter was in the encampment at her university. She's not a self-hating Jew. She does not support Hamas, God forbid, or any violence at all. In fact, it is her aversion to violence and to war that led her to that encampment in the first place. She just doesn't want any more people to die. And she said that she found no place in the Jewish community where she could express that view without being called a traitor to her people. So she found community where she could, in the encampment. For months, her alienation from the Jewish community grew, but one day, not long ago, she got a call from another student on her same campus. These two girls used to go to camp together. The second student is proud Israeli American. The two hadn't talked to one another in nearly a year. I'm having a gathering, the second student said. Jewish students from across the spectrum, no grown-ups, no agenda, because we have to find a way to hear each other. We have to find a way to stay in relationship. Those two girls and a small group of other students sat together for hours, They spoke to one another and they listened. They disagreed and they found surprising areas of agreement. They cried. They were just kids in college, talking together about something that they both cared deeply and passionately about. They saw one another, their hope and their heartache, and they became sisters again. Because the fact is, it is very hard to demonize another person when they're right there in front of you, bruised and brokenhearted just like you are. The student from the encampment said that this was the first time that she felt like part of the Jewish community all year. Eventually, in our story, Miriam is healed and she is brought back into the camp. And she goes on to live with her two brothers for another 38 years. We have no idea what happened in those intervening years. It's the great ellipses in the text. We only know that many years later, in the book of Numbers, chapter 26, when their mother is described, she is described as the woman who bore to Amram, Aharon, Moshe, and their sister, Miriam. Miriam dies not as Aaron's sister, but as the sister of Aaron and Moshe. A tikkun for sure. This family was able to heal. And I believe that our family can heal too. But it will require a lot of us. It starts with a willingness to turn toward one another when all we want to do is turn away from one another in hurt and pain and disdain. It will require a sense of urgency, and it will require great humility. El na rifana lanu. Please God, help us heal.